Montana, December 1889. The valley holds its silence the way the cold holds everything God, completely. She had $38, a horse nearly finished, and a proposal she had never spoken aloud to anyone.
Nell. Something in his eyes told her Bine. He had been waiting.
The horse nearly gave out on her 2 miles before she reached the ranch. Nell Ashford felt it in the animal's gait, that subtle, desperate shortening of stride that had nothing to do with the terrain and everything to do with what was left inside the creature carrying her. She loosened the reins and leaned forward, pressing one gloved hand against Juniper's neck. The coat was damp despite the cold. Beneath her palm she could feel the trembling that had nothing to do with temperature. "Just a little more," she said quietly. The words came out steadier than she felt. That was a skill she had spent most of her adult life developing, making the outside of herself calmer than the inside, presenting a surface that didn't reveal the depth of what was happening underneath. It was a useful skill. It had kept her functioning through a dead harvest, through the death of a husband who left nothing behind but debt and silence, through 3 Montana winters that had broken stronger people than her. It had not, however, kept her from ending up here, riding through the gray-white nothing of a December morning with $38 to her name, and a proposal forming in her mouth that no woman with options would ever have to make. Around her, the valley had gone the color of old wool, snow packed over frozen ground, dead grass jutting up through the crust in brittle yellow clumps, the sky pressing low against the ridgeline as though the weight of it might finally give way. It was the kind of landscape that didn't try to be anything. It just was what it was, hard, indifferent, completely uninterested in whether you made it through. Nell had grown up in country like this. She understood it in the way you understood something that had shaped you whether you wanted it to or not. What she hadn't understood, or hadn't let herself understand until 3 days ago, was that she had finally run out of ways to outlast it. The room at Mabel Hutchins' boarding house on the east side of Millhaven had been hers for 4 years. $2 a month, shared woodpile, no visitors after dark. The window frame had a crack she'd learned to seal with a folded flour sack. The draft under the door responded to a particular arrangement of the braided rug she'd bought secondhand from the mercantile. She had stopped thinking of it as temporary. She had made the mistake of believing that endurance was the same thing as permanence. Then Mabel's son-in-law arrived from Billings with money and opinions, and by Tuesday morning Nell was standing in the road with her leather satchel in one hand and nowhere particular to go. She had spent 2 nights in Walt Pearson's livery, which Walt had pretended not to notice in the particular way of a decent man caught between his conscience and his circumstances. On the 3rd morning he'd found a reason to need the space. She understood. She didn't blame him. That didn't make it easier to saddle Juniper in the dark before the town woke up and could witness her leaving. The fence line of Iron Creek Ranch appeared through the snow haze as the sky began to shift from black to the dull gray of early morning, weathered posts and wire that seemed to go on longer than made sense, marking land that didn't announce itself the way some operations did. No painted sign, no grand entrance, just fence, then more fence, and eventually a lane of packed dirt leading toward a cluster of dark shapes she recognized from a distance as buildings. She had been to Iron Creek Ranch once before, when she was 16. Her father had brought her in the wagon to settle some business she hadn't been made privy to. She remembered waiting by the horses, looking at the mountains, and the smell of wood smoke coming from the house. She remembered a wide porch and the low sound of men speaking seriously about something that mattered to them. She remembered nothing about the man her father had spoken with. Only the mountains and the smoke and the particular quality of stillness that seemed to belong to that piece of land. Now she was the one who needed something from it. Juniper made it to the yard at a walk. Nell didn't push her. She stepped down from the saddle beside a water trough with a skin of ice across the top, looped the reins over the post, and stood for a moment with both hands pressed flat against her thighs. She wasn't sure if she was trying to warm her palms or steady her nerves. She suspected it was both. The house was larger than she remembered. 2 stories, the upper half sided in dark wood weathered to the color of charcoal. A lamp burned in the front window. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, barely bending in the air. Almost no wind today, which was its own kind of strange for this time of year in the valley. She walked to the door and knocked 3 times, not too hard, not soft enough to ignore. She heard movement inside immediately. Not the rushed movement of someone startled from sleep, but the steady, deliberate movement of a person who was already awake and already somewhere near the front of the house. The latch lifted. The door swung inward. Corbin Greer stood in the frame and looked at her. He was taller than she had expected, which was a strange thing to notice given that she had not been expecting anything in particular about his height. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 4 or 5 days, and eyes the particular shade of brown that made her think of river water in late October. Clear but not bright, still but not empty. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has already made a decision about and is simply waiting for the right moment to say so. Then he said, "Miss Ashford," not a question, not a greeting, a statement delivered with the same quiet certainty with which a man might note the weather. Nell's prepared words evaporated entirely. She had planned for the usual sequence, the polite confusion, the introductions, the small social machinery that gave a person a few seconds to collect themselves before the real conversation began. She had not planned for him to already know her name. She had never spoken to this man in her life. She was certain of that, the way you were certain of things you had reviewed carefully because they mattered. "You know who I am," she said. "Your father brought you here once. You were about 16. He stepped back from the doorway. Not an invitation exactly, but not a barrier either. "Come inside before you freeze." She went in. The front room was warmer than she'd expected and plainer than most. A stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, burning low but steady. A table with 2 chairs pulled close. A shelf holding tools and books mixed together without particular order. A bridle hanging on the same peg as a hammer. A volume of something leaning against a tin coffee pot. A rug on the floor that had once been patterned and was now worn down to suggestion. It was not a comfortable room in the way that rooms designed for guests were comfortable. It was a room built for someone who actually lived in it. She found that easier to be inside than a room that was performing something. Corbin moved to the fireplace and added another piece of wood without asking whether she wanted more heat. She was grateful for that. She was tired of being asked about her comfort by people who weren't in any position to do anything about it. "Coffee?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. He went to the kitchen. She heard the sound of a pot being set on iron, water being poured, the particular domestic sounds of someone who knew where everything was without having to look. She stood near the fire and let the warmth work into her hands and her face, and she thought about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. And she realized that the speech she had composed and refined over the 3 hours of writing had left her entirely, and now she had nothing but the plain truth. Fine, she would say it plain. He came back with 2 cups, handed her one, and sat down at the table without the posture of a man waiting to be entertained or explained to. He sat like a man with a few minutes and no particular urgency about how to use them. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth moved through the ceramic and into her palms, and she breathed out once, slowly, and decided that there was no version of this that was not what it was. "I need to propose something to you," she said. "All right. I lost my room 3 days ago. The Hutchins place on the east side of town. Her son-in-law claimed it." She kept her voice level. She had made peace with the facts, if not with the shape they had taken. "I spent 2 nights in Walt Pearson's livery before he needed the space. I have $38, a horse, the clothes I'm wearing, and a few things in that satchel." She paused because this was the part that still felt like pressing a bruise. "And I have skills. I can keep accounts accurately and completely. I can sew well enough to be worth paying for. I know livestock well enough to be useful around a working ranch." Corbin said nothing. He watched her with that particular brown stillness. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm asking for a transaction. I'll work this ranch, whatever needs doing, in exchange for a roof and enough food to get through the winter." She stopped because she had already come this far and there was not much left to lose. "And I think the most honest arrangement, the one that protects us both from what people in this valley will say, is if we get married on paper legally. So there's no question about what this is." She had prepared for silence. She had prepared for argument, for polite refusal, for the slow, careful negotiations of a man who needed time to think. She had not prepared for what happened instead. "Yes," Corbin said. She stared at him. "Excuse me? Yes, I'll marry you." He said it the way he had said her name at the door, with the quiet certainty of a man who had already arrived at this answer before the question was fully asked. There was no performance in it. No surprise, no visible calculation. He simply said it and then picked up his coffee and waited. "You should know what you're agreeing to," Nell said carefully, because she was a person who needed things to be clear between people who were going to share a roof. "I'm offering a practical arrangement, nothing else. I want that understood from the beginning." "It's understood," he said. "Same on my end." She looked at him steadily, searching for something she could identify as an angle, a motive, a complication hiding just behind the plainness of his face. She didn't find one, which didn't mean it wasn't there. She had learned that lesson young enough that it had become permanent, but it wasn't visible. "You don't have questions," she said. "I have plenty." He stood and carried his cup to the kitchen. When he came back, he was pulling on his coat and reaching for his hat on the hook by the door. "But they'll keep. Right now your horse needs water and feed." He opened the door and went outside. Nell stood in the warm front room with her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee and listened to the sound of his boots on the porch steps fading toward the barn. She stood there for a long moment. Then she found the stairs and went up. The hallway at the top was narrow, with 2 doors on one side and a window at the end that looked out over the snow-covered yard. She stood there for a moment before opening the first door. The room was not what she expected. It was not grand. Nothing about this house was grand, but it was arranged. That was the word that kept returning to her as she stood in the doorway, taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything, quietly, completely, without an ounce she was doing. The bed had a proper quilt on it, not a work blanket. She could see the wear at the seams from across the room, but it was clean and folded back at one corner with a deliberateness that suggested intention rather than habit. There was a small desk beneath the window, and on the desk were 2 candles in a holder, a lamp, and a tin cup. She crossed to the desk and looked into the cup. Needles, thread in 4 colors wound on fresh spools, unbroken at the cut ends. A small pair of scissors with bone handles. She set her palm flat on the desk and stood very still. The thread was new, not left behind by some previous occupant, not the remnant of someone else's life in this room. The spools were unbroken. The scissors had the particular look of something that had never been used. Someone had purchased these things and placed them here deliberately, with knowledge of what they were for and who would want them. She opened the small wardrobe in the corner, mostly empty the way a guest room wardrobe was empty. But on the top shelf, folded with care, was a length of good wool fabric, dark blue, the kind that held against wind, and beside it a paper of pins. She closed the wardrobe slowly. She went to the window and looked down into the yard. Below, Corbin was leading Juniper into the barn, one hand on the bridle, moving without hurry. The mare was walking without fuss, her exhaustion apparently willing to trust the pace he set. Nell turned the room over in her mind the way you turned a stone over when you needed to know what was underneath. The sewing supplies were specific. Not an accident, not a coincidence, not something left from whoever had last used this room, whoever that had been. The needles were new, the spools were new, the wool was still sharp at the fold. Someone had put these things in this room for a woman who sewed. And the only woman who sewed who had any connection to this ranch was standing at the window right now, watching a man she had never spoken to care for her horse with the same unhurried attention he seemed to bring to everything. She did not yet allow herself to follow that thought to where it was trying to go. She was tired. She was colder than she had realized until the warmth of this house began to reveal it. The particular exhaustion of fear that has been performing as composure for 3 days, finally beginning to dissolve now that it no longer had to hold the shape of something else. Her eyes stung with it. She did not cry. She had not let herself do that yet, and she didn't see a reason to start now. But she sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands between her knees and breathed slowly, and she thought, someone expected something. Someone arranged this room for a purpose that was not yet visible to her, but that was visible in every carefully chosen object on that desk and that shelf. She would need to understand that, but not tonight. They were married 6 days later. The justice of the peace, a small man named Gerald Hatch, who had been performing civil ceremonies for 20 years and had the words memorized to the point of smoothness, drove out from Dillon with the papers already prepared. Frank Rudd, Corbin's ranch hand, a man of 55 with the weathered patience of someone who had been doing the same work for 3 decades and found genuine satisfaction in it, stood as witness on one side. Patch, the younger hand whose real name no one seemed to use, stood on the other side wearing a hat that was demonstrably too large for him and the expression of a young man enduring a formal occasion. Frank shook Nell's hand afterward with a care that suggested he had been instructed to treat her well and was making a sincere effort at it. Patch nodded at her once from under the brim of the oversized hat and looked relieved when the whole thing was over. Gerald Hatch had his buggy turned around and was heading back down the lane before the snow started again. 11 minutes, start to finish. Frank and Patch found reasons to be elsewhere. Nell and Corbin stood on the porch in the gray afternoon light for a moment that was not quite comfortable and not quite awkward. I can have supper on in an hour, she said. You don't have to. I want to. She meant it practically. She needed to do something useful, needed to put her hands to work and let the rest of her settle. She suspected he heard both meanings because he simply nodded and went toward the barn without further discussion. The routine established itself faster than she expected. Nell had always operated best inside structure she built herself, not the imposed kind, but the kind that gave shape to a day and made forward motion possible. On a working ranch in the belly of a Montana winter, there was no shortage of work. The question was only where she fit inside it. She made breakfast before full light. She and Corbin ate largely in silence, which did not feel unfriendly. It felt like two people who had agreed, without saying so, that the space between them didn't need to be filled with noise to be tolerable. There was something between them that hadn't been named yet, and she was in no particular hurry to name it. She was more interested in understanding what it actually was before she put a word to it. She took over the accounts on the second day. The books were a mess. Not from carelessness. She came to understand that quickly. Corbin was not a careless man. He was a man who had been doing everything himself between everything else, and the accounts had accumulated the way things accumulated when a capable person simply ran out of hours. She sat at the desk in the front room with the ledgers spread and 3 different sets of receipts in 3 different handwritings, and she worked through it methodically. Start at the beginning. Follow each thread. Don't move forward until the previous thing is settled. On the 4th day, she found the discrepancy. It wasn't large in the way that demanded immediate action, but it was consistent in the way that revealed intention. 14 deliveries over 2 years from the feed supplier in Dillon. The weights on the ranch's receiving records didn't match the weights on the supplier's invoices. Each individual shortfall was small enough to overlook. Together, they added up to $63. She brought the ledger to Corbin at lunch, opened to the relevant columns, and set it on the table beside his plate. September last year. Your receipt says 42 bushels. The supplier's copy says 38. She put her finger on the line. 14 deliveries with the same gap. I'll have the exact total confirmed by tonight. Corbin looked at the numbers. Then he looked at her in a way that was different from how most men looked at figures they hadn't caught themselves. You found that in 4 days, he said. I was looking. He was quiet for a moment. I knew the numbers weren't right. I couldn't find where. He folded his hands on the table. What do you suggest we do about it? She looked at him. He was actually asking. Write directly to the company in Dillon, not the local dealer. Send the comparison receipts and ask for a written explanation. Give them 2 weeks. If they don't respond, file a formal complaint with the county office. It's not enough for a lawyer, but a complaint on record costs them more than paying you back. Do it, he said. Not, that sounds reasonable. Let me think on it. Not, I'll handle it from here. Just do it. The way a man who trusted someone's judgment said the thing clearly and moved on. She went back to her work and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the particular satisfaction of being useful to a degree that was actually acknowledged. That evening she sat at the table with the full collection of receipts spread out and worked through each delivery. Corbin came in from the cold around 7, stomped snow from his boots at the door, and stood for a moment looking at the papers covering the table without saying anything. $63 over 2 years, she said without looking up. 14 deliveries. The silence from across the room had a particular quality. She had begun to notice that his silences were not all the same. This one was the silence of a man recalibrating something. Write the letter in the morning, she said. If you want to review it first. No, he said. I trust your judgment on it. She looked up then, because it was the kind of sentence that could mean different things depending on who was saying it and why. There was no performance in his face. He wasn't managing her with a compliment. He was just saying a thing he meant and waiting for her to receive it as such. She looked back at her papers. Supper in 30 minutes, she said. It was Frank who said the thing that first cracked something open. He came looking for her in the barn toward the end of the second week, needing a strip of leather to patch a broken harness trace. She was reorganizing the supply chest near the tack room and heard him come in before she saw him. He was one of those men who move through a space with the same unhurried certainty they brought to everything else. The kind of man who had been in enough barns to know that sudden movements served no purpose. He found what he was looking for, and he was almost to the door when he stopped with his back still to her and said, in the particular manner of a man who had been considering whether to speak for a while and had finally decided to, he fixed up that room in the spring, the one you're in now. Nell kept her hands in the supply chest. When in the spring? March maybe, April at the latest. I remember because we had a run of warm days and he worked on the window frame. Said it had been sticking. Frank held up the leather strip he'd found. Bought new ticking for the mattress too. Cricket and I, that's what we used to call Patch before he decided he didn't like it. We figured he was expecting someone. Family, maybe. But no one came. No. Frank turned and looked at her for the first time since starting the conversation. His eyes had the quality of a man who observed carefully and drew conclusions slowly and didn't share them until he was reasonably certain. Anyway, found my leather. He went out. Nell stood in the barn with her hands still in the supply chest, not moving, going through the arithmetic in her head with the same precision she brought to the account books. March or April of 1889. That was 8, possibly 9 months before she knocked on the front door of this house. In March or April of 1889, she had been living in her rented room at Mabel Hutchins' boarding house, working alterations for 3 households in town, paying her $2 a month, folding flour sacks against drafts, and giving no thought whatsoever to Corbin Greer or Iron Creek Ranch. She had not spoken his name in years. She had no business with this land, no connection to it, no reason for anyone here to be thinking about her. And yet in March or April of 1889, someone had bought new mattress ticking and fixed a sticking window frame and put fresh thread in a tin cup on a desk in a room that no one was using. She went back to the house and stood in the kitchen looking at the kettle on the stove, and she tried, seriously and methodically, to build an explanation for this that was not the obvious one. Maybe the room had been prepared for someone else and she was drawing connections where there were none. Maybe Frank had the timing wrong. Maybe the thread had been there for years and she had simply mistaken wear for newness. She went upstairs and opened the wardrobe and took the blue wool from the shelf and examined the selvage edge. Uncut, unhandled, the fold crease still sharp from the mill. This was not old fabric. This was fabric that had never been touched by anyone before she put her hands on it. She put it back carefully and stood in the room for a long moment. Someone had thought about what this room needed. Someone had considered it with enough specificity to choose 4 colors of thread, the right weight of wool, scissors with handles made for a woman's hand. Someone had thought about who was coming. She did not yet know how that was possible. She knew only that it was true, in the way that certain things were true before you had the evidence to prove them. The way you knew a storm was coming before the sky showed you. The way you knew a person's character before they'd done anything to demonstrate it. The knowledge sat in her chest with a weight that was not frightening and not entirely comfortable. She went downstairs and made supper and set 2 plates on the table, and when Corbin came in from the cold, she passed him the bread without comment, and they ate in their particular silence, and she watched him from the corner of her eye and tried to understand what it was exactly that she was looking at. He was a private man. She had established that within 48 hours. He spoke when he had something to say and was genuinely quiet the rest of the time, without the anxious fidgeting of a person who found silence threatening. He was consistent in a way that she had come to find, against her own expectations, reassuring rather than boring. She had spent enough of her life around inconsistency to understand the value of its opposite. He treated her with a straightforward respect that she had not been prepared for. Not the performed courtesy of a man managing a woman he considered fragile, but the practical, unornamented respect of someone who had looked at what she was capable of and decided it was worth taking seriously. When she spoke, he listened. When she had an opinion, he considered it. When she solved a problem, he acknowledged it, simply, and moved on without making a ceremony of it. She found herself wondering what that cost him, whether it was effortless or whether it was something he had learned. And she found herself wondering what else he had learned, and when, and why. The night before she planned to go through the rest of the account ledgers, Nell lay in the bed with the good quilt pulled to her chin and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had known her name before she told him, who had said yes before she finished asking, who had put needles and thread on a desk in a room that had been waiting. She did not have answers yet. She was not the kind of person who reached for conclusions before the evidence supported them. She had learned that lesson young and at some cost. But she was the kind of person who recognized when she was standing at the edge of something significant, even if she couldn't yet see what was on the other side. Outside the window, snow was falling again, soft and patient, the way it fell in Montana when it wasn't in a hurry to make a point. She would find out what this was. She would be methodical about it, the same way she was methodical about everything that mattered. She would follow each thread to where it led, and she would not move forward until she understood what she was looking at. For now, she lay in the room that had been arranged for her before she had any reason to be in it, and she let herself feel, for the first time in a long time, something that was not entirely fear and not entirely hope, but lived somewhere in the uncertain territory between them. That was enough for tonight. The supply letter to the feed company in Dillon went out on a Tuesday. She wrote it at the kitchen table before first light, 3 drafts before she was satisfied with the tone. Firm without being combative, precise without leaving room for ambiguity, the kind of letter that demonstrated clearly that the person who wrote it understood exactly what they were talking about and would not be managed. She included copies of 4 of the most clearly mismatched receipt pairs and noted that the remaining 10 were available upon request. She sealed it and left it on the table where Corbin would see it when he came in. He picked it up, looked at the envelope for a moment, and then looked at her with something she was beginning to recognize as his version of approval, which was not a smile or a compliment, but a particular quality of attention. The kind that said, "I see what you did and I understand its value. I'll take it to town this afternoon," he said. She nodded and went back to the next page of accounts. Outside, the snow fell and the valley held them both in its long, cold, patient quiet. The fire in the front room burned steady. The lamp on her desk cast its small circle of light. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a question that hadn't been asked yet was gathering itself slowly with the same unhurried patience as everything else in this house, waiting for the moment when she would finally be ready to ask it. The town was the problem. She had known it would be. She had 3 weeks of relative peace before the weather broke enough to make the trip practical. The blizzard that came in hard on the 5th day of her marriage had kept everyone close to their own fires, and she was grateful for that in the way you were grateful for a delay you knew was only a delay. But when the first real break in the weather arrived in mid-January, Corbin said he needed to collect the mail and a few supplies from Millhaven, and she understood without being told that she would be coming with him. The ride in was quiet. The road had been packed by a few days of relative calm, and the horses moved well. Corbin sat beside her on the wagon bench with his usual economy of movement, and she sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her mind running through the likely shape of what was coming. She had lived in Millhaven for 4 years. She knew the town the way you knew any small place you depended on. Its rhythms, its loyalties, the invisible architecture of who deferred to whom and why. She knew which conversations happened at the front of the dry goods store and which ones happened at the back. She knew whose opinion carried weight and whose carried the pretense of weight. She had navigated that landscape carefully for 4 years, keeping her head down, doing her work, taking up as little space as possible. That was finished now. She understood that. You could not arrive at a man's door with a proposal and a satchel and walk back into the same invisible life you had left. The town would have an opinion. The only question was the form it would take. Helen Voss was already at the counter of the dry goods store when Nell walked in. Helen was the wife of August Voss, who ran the valley's most profitable lumber operation and therefore considered himself, and by extension his wife, to be the center of certain social arrangements in Millhaven. Helen was a handsome woman of 50 with the particular skill of a person who had spent decades making cruelty indistinguishable from concern. She had two women with her, Clara Alderman, who had always been passingly civil to Nell in the years she'd lived in town, and a woman Nell didn't recognize, younger, with the watchful expression of someone still learning the local hierarchies. Helen turned when the door opened. Her face arranged itself into an expression of bright, particular neutrality. "Mrs. Greer," she said. "My goodness, we were just talking about you." The way she said it made absolutely clear that this was not a pleasant coincidence. "Mrs. Voss," Nell said. "We were saying how remarkable it was that you managed to find such a—" Helen paused, turning her face slightly upward in the performance of a woman choosing her words with great delicacy. "Such a situation, and just before winter, too." Clara Alderman was looking at the floor. The woman Nell didn't recognize made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Nell turned to the man behind the counter. "I'm looking for the number 8 waxed linen thread and a spool of the cambric if you have it in white." "Of course, Mrs. Greer." He turned to look. Nell moved to the counter, which placed her back to Helen Voss by design rather than accident. The effect was the same either way. "I do hope," Helen continued, addressing the middle distance with the tone of someone sharing a private concern with the room, "that poor Mr. Greer understands what he's taken on. A woman with no family, no property, he understands exactly what he's taken on," Nell said. Her voice was level. She had spent most of her adult life practicing level in situations like this. "He married me." A small silence. "Of course he did," Helen said pleasantly. "Of course." The thread was placed on the counter. Nell paid for it. She thanked the man behind the counter, who had the expression of someone who wished he were somewhere else, and she walked back out into the cold. She sat in the wagon and looked at the horse's ears for 30 seconds. Not because she needed to compose herself. She had done that inside, in the space between sentences where you learned either to fall apart or to hold, but because she needed a moment to let the particular weight of that kind of encounter settle into its proper place before she moved past it. It wasn't anger, exactly. She had dealt with Helen Voss's particular variety of social cruelty long enough to understand its mechanics. It operated through suggestion and implication, leaving no mark you could point to directly. The damage it did was real, but it was designed to be unprovable, and that was the point of it. Fighting it directly gave it more weight than it deserved. She breathed out through her nose and let the cold air do what it did. Corbin came out of the post office across the street and walked to the wagon. He climbed up beside her without asking how the store had been. She was grateful for that, too. "Letter from Dylan," he said, handing it to her. She opened it and read it quickly. "They're disputing 4 of the 14 deliveries. The rest they're willing to correct. How much does that leave? $22 if they hold on all 4 disputed." She folded the letter. "They won't. I'll write back tonight. They know we have documentation on everyone." He clicked to the horses and the wagon moved out of town. She watched the buildings slide past and then fall away behind them, and she sat with her hands in her lap and let the distance do its work. He didn't ask about the store. She didn't tell him. What happened in there belonged to her in a way she wasn't ready to share yet, not because she didn't trust him, but because she hadn't finished deciding what she thought about it herself. The particular artistry of what Helen Voss did required a certain amount of private processing before you could handle it without heat. She looked at the fence line of Iron Creek as they turned into the lane, and she thought, "This is mine now, too. Whatever that woman in the store thinks she knows about how I came to be here, this is mine." The thought had more weight than she expected. She held on to it the rest of the way home. The reply to the feed company took her 2 drafts in 40 minutes. She was not combative. She did not accuse. She simply laid out, with the same precise clarity she brought to every column of numbers, exactly why each of the 4 disputed deliveries showed the same pattern of discrepancy as the 10 they had already conceded, and she noted that the county office maintained records of formal complaints that tended to be consulted by other ranchers in the region when selecting suppliers. She left it on the table. Corbin read it in the morning without comment and took it to town the following week. 3 weeks later, the corrected payment arrived, all $63 of it. She noted it in the ledger without ceremony. Frank came in from outside that afternoon and found her at the table. "Heard the feed company in Dillon paid out," he said. "They did. Good." He got a cup of coffee and went back out. That was the whole of it, and she found it more satisfying than a larger celebration would have been. The accounts were in order now. She had cross-referenced the supplier records, reconciled the livestock purchase receipts going back 3 years, and built a clear picture of what Iron Creek Ranch cost to run and what it produced. She had started maintaining her own parallel set of notes alongside the official ledger, a private record of observations, questions, things she had noticed that she hadn't yet located within a larger pattern. She was organized by nature and disliked having things exist only in her head where they couldn't be examined properly. The list in her private notes had been growing. The chamomile tea, the room with its new supplies, Frank's 8-month timeline, the way Corbin had said her name at the door without being told it, the way he had said yes without being given a reason. Written down, the items were harder to minimize than they were in her head, where she could always find a counter-argument if she looked for one. On paper, they simply were what they were. She had not yet written down the item that had been occupying the back of her mind since the first week, the locked barn. It was the smaller of the two outbuildings on the property, set back past the woodpile and the second corral. She had noted it early on. She noted everything, systematically, as a matter of habit, and had filed it mentally as a storage structure, probably for equipment or feed, and moved on. But on a gray afternoon in the third week, she had walked past it on her way to check on Juniper and noticed something she hadn't registered the first time. The padlock on the door was not a working ranch padlock. It was heavy iron, old and serious, the kind of lock you put on something when you were concerned, not about people but about time, about weather and loss, and the particular way that important things deteriorated if left unprotected. It was the lock of a person keeping something safe, not secret. She had stood in front of that door for a moment, looking at the lock, and then she had walked on. She walked past it the next day and the day after that. Each time Shell noted it, and each time she kept moving. She was not a person who broke into things. She had spent her entire adult life being precisely the kind of person who could be trusted inside other people's spaces, and that mattered to her more than curiosity. But the lock was there every time she passed. And the question of what required that quality of protection on a working ranch was there too, patient as everything else on this property. It was on an afternoon in late January that Dorothy Crane came by. Dorothy was the wife of Harlan Crane, who ran a smaller cattle operation 4 miles east and who had the settled contentment of a man who had made his peace with what he had. Dorothy herself was in her mid-50s, solidly built, with sharp eyes and the directness of a woman who had invested too much of her earlier life in indirectness and had given it up as a bad return on the effort. She arrived with a jar of pickled beets and an obvious agenda, both of which Nell respected. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Dorothy talked about the valley in the winter and the church roof in Millhaven that had needed repairs since October, and Nell listened and responded and waited. She could feel the real conversation gathering itself just behind the social one, the way weather gathered behind a ridgeline before it came over. It arrived on the third cup. "Tom said something interesting," Dorothy said, turning her cup in her hands with the deliberateness of a woman choosing her approach. "When we heard about you and Corbin, he said maybe Greer finally did what he'd been putting off." Nell kept her voice easy. "What did Tom mean by that?" I asked him. He said Corbin had been talking about the guest room since early spring, wanting to get it set right. Dorothy's expression was thoughtful, the expression of a woman holding a piece of a puzzle she hadn't yet decided where to place. Tom thought he was expecting family, but no family came, and the room just sat there, all done up. Nell looked at her coffee. "Early spring," she said. "February or March," Tom thought. "Maybe earlier." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "He never mentioned anyone to us, just the room. February or March. That was earlier than Frank had said. That was closer to 10 months before Nell had knocked on the front door of this house. 10 months before she had any reason to be here, any connection to this land, any thought of Corbin Greer at all. He's a private man," Nell said. "He is," Dorothy agreed. She looked at Nell over the rim of her coffee cup with the gaze of a woman who had decided to ask the thing she actually wanted to ask. "Are you all right here? Is he? Is everything?" "Everything is fine," Nell said. And then, because Dorothy deserved something more honest than a social answer, "He's a decent man. Quieter than most, but decent in a way that holds up. I haven't found an edge to it yet." Dorothy nodded slowly, filing that away. "Good," she said. "That's good to know." After she left, Nell sat at the table with the jar of pickled beets in front of her and thought about 10 months. 10 months ago, she had been in her room at Mabel Hutchins' house, working alterations for Mrs. Lindquist and keeping careful track of the $2 she needed for rent and not thinking about the future, because thinking about the future was a luxury that required a certain amount of stability she didn't have. She had been invisible in the way that people without resources became invisible in small towns, present but not particularly registered, managing and not failing, which in the accounting of Millhaven amounted to the same thing as not mattering. And in that same period, Corbin Greer had been buying mattress ticking and fixing window frames and putting needles and thread in a tin cup in a room no one was using. She went upstairs and opened a wardrobe and took the blue wool from the shelf and looked at it again in the winter light from the window. The fold crease, the uncut selvage, the particular stiffness of fabric that had never been washed or worn or handled in any way except being placed carefully on a shelf by a person who had thought about where it should go. She put it back. She stood in the room that had been arranged for her before she existed as a possibility in this house, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought, who prepares a room for someone they have never spoken to, and for how long before they do it do they carry that intention? She didn't have the answer yet, but she was getting closer to understanding that there was one. It was the tea that finally made her say something out loud. She had been cataloging the small impossibilities for weeks by then, carrying them in her private notebook alongside the account figures, turning them over at night when the house was quiet. The kitchen lamp that was always turned low instead of out when Corbin went to bed before her because she worked late and preferred to find the room lit rather than dark. The firewood box that was always full on the mornings she had planned to fill it herself, as though someone had checked it in the night without mentioning it. The way he handled her opinions in front of Frank and Patch. Not loudly, not with ceremony, just with the simple inclusion of a man who had decided that what she thought was worth considering and saw no reason to make a production of that decision. Each one she could explain away individually. She had explained them away one by one, methodically, because she was a careful person and careful people did not rush toward conclusions. But the pile of explanations had grown heavy enough that she couldn't carry it anymore without noticing the weight. And then the chamomile appeared. It was a Thursday morning in the first week of February. She opened the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet and found a small cloth bag of dried chamomile tied with kitchen twine, placed exactly where she would have put it if she had put it there herself. She stood in front of the open cabinet for a long time. She had not bought it. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She had not asked for it and had not expressed any preference for it to any person in this house or in this valley that she could recall. She put on her coat and her hat and she went outside to find Corbin. He was mending a section of fence near the second corral, crouched with pliers and a length of wire, doing the kind of work that occupied the hands without requiring the full attention which left room for conversation. She stopped a few feet away and waited until she was sure he had registered her presence. "The chamomile in the cabinet," she said. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the twist of wire he was working on, and then he straightened and turned to look at her. His expression was the same as it usually was. Settled, not concealing anything, just a man who had made peace with the fact that something was going on inside him and wasn't trying to pretend otherwise. "Frank's wife sells dried herbs in the winter," he said. "Good business with the ranches in the valley. I didn't ask you for it. No. I never told you I drank chamomile." A pause, the kind that wasn't evasion but wasn't readiness either. Something in between. "No," he said again. She looked at him steadily. "Then how did you know?" He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet she had come to understand was not avoiding the question but deciding how to answer it honestly. He turned back to the fence and crouched again, fitting the pliers to the next section that needed attention. "You used to buy it from the alderman's shop," he said. "On Thursdays when they had it in stock." Nell did not move. "You watched me shop," she said. "I was in town most Thursdays." He was working the wire, not looking at her. "I wasn't watching. I noticed." She stood outside that fence in the February cold and felt the particular sensation of a floor shifting under her feet in a room she had believed was solid. She was not a woman who fell apart in front of people. She had never been that woman, and she did not intend to become her now. But she felt something move through her that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite any emotion she had a clean name for. It was closer to the feeling of realizing that the map you had been using to navigate was drawn wrong, and now you had to figure out where you actually were. "For how long?" she said. He looked up at her then. His eyes were the same river water brown they always were, clear, still, and in this moment carrying something she hadn't seen in them before. Something that was less resolved than his usual expression. Something that was still in the process of being decided. "A while," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know," he said, and he held her gaze without flinching, without apologizing, without filling the space with something easier than the truth. She waited. He didn't add anything else. She turned and walked back to the house, and she heard the pliers working behind her, steady and unhurried, as though nothing significant had just happened. But she knew something had happened. She just didn't have the shape of it yet. She threw herself into the work with the particular kind of focus she brought to everything she wasn't ready to address directly. The ranch's legal documentation needed organizing. Survey maps, original land grants, tax receipts going back 15 years, water rights filings for the creek on the east section of the property. She requested copies of the county records from Dillon, and when they arrived she spent 3 days cross-referencing them against what Corbin had on file, building a complete picture of what Iron Creek Ranch was and what it was worth. It was worth considerably more than she had initially understood. Not in the way that made a man rich by any standard she recognized, but in the way that made a man's land genuinely significant to the people around him. The water rights attached to the East Creek were the key of it. The creek that ran through Iron Creek Ranch was the most reliable water source in a 6-mile radius. Any property downstream depended on what happened to that water, and the original rights filing done by Corbin's father 30 years ago and renewed twice since was comprehensive, clear, and fully documented. She noted it, filed it, and moved on. But she thought about it again on the morning that Patch came into the barn looking for a lead rope and found her there instead, working on a cracked stitching in Juniper's saddle girth. He found his rope and was almost back to the door when he stopped with his back to her, in the way that she had noticed was how he delivered information he wasn't certain he should be delivering. "He used to ride past your place sometimes," Patch said. "In town, the east side, where you used to live." Nell kept her hands on the leather. "How often?" "Not regular. Few times a year, maybe. At night, mostly. He was examining the lead rope with unnecessary attention. I went with him once, asked what we were doing." He paused. He said, checking the road. "Was the road fine?" "Road was fine." He went out. Nell sat with the saddle girth in her lap and the needle threaded and her mind doing something complicated behind her steady expression. She turned the information over carefully, the way she turned everything over, looking at it from every angle before she allowed herself a conclusion. She was not frightened. She examined that possibility seriously, and it didn't fit. There was nothing in what she had observed of Corbin Greer that suggested the dark variety of fixation. No possessiveness, no pressure, no sense that he was owed anything by her proximity to his awareness. The man who had said yes in 2 seconds and then gone to care for her horse. The man who left the kitchen lamp burning low. The man who asked what she thought and waited for the actual answer. That was not the shape of something to be afraid of. What she felt instead, sitting in the cold barn with Juniper warm and patient beside her and the winter light coming gray through the door, was something she hadn't expected and didn't quite have a category for. She felt like she had been seen, not watched. Seen, from a careful, respectful distance, by someone who had wanted nothing from her except for her to be all right, who had recorded her small acts of decency in the only way available to him, by noticing them, by refusing to let them disappear into the indifference of a world that mostly didn't pay attention to the quiet things people did when they thought no one was looking. That was the strangest part, and it sat in her chest in a way that was not comfortable and not threatening and not anything she could easily file away and move past. She finished the stitching and put the saddle back on its rack and went inside to make supper. The storm came in from the northwest without much warning, the way the worst ones always did. Nell had been watching the sky since morning, with the particular attention of someone who had grown up reading weather the way others read text. Tracking the color of the light, the way the horses stood in the corral, the direction the crows flew before the clouds even appeared. By midday, she knew it was going to be serious. By early afternoon, the temperature had dropped 8 degrees and the wind had gone from nothing to something substantial in the space of an hour. Corbin and Frank had ridden out before first light to check the south fence. Patch was somewhere on the property, but she hadn't seen him since breakfast. She was alone in the house when the sky went the color of a bruise and the snow began, not the soft kind, but the other kind, the kind that came in sideways and reduced the world to 10 feet of visibility and made everything beyond that theoretical. She fed the stove, checked the water supply, moved through her mental list of what a serious storm required. She had enough provisions for 2 days without going outside. The horses were in the main barn. She had moved Juniper herself that morning, trusting the sky before it gave her a reason to. There was nothing to do but wait. She waited for 4 hours before she stopped being able to. It wasn't panic. She wasn't built for panic, and she didn't have time for it. It was the specific restlessness of a person who processed difficulty through action and had run out of indoor actions. She had been through the pantry inventory twice. She had organized the kitchen shelves by category and then reorganized them by size, just to see which system she actually preferred. She had sat at the desk and looked at the account ledger without seeing a single number. What she kept seeing instead was the padlock on the barn door. And behind the padlock, visible through a gap in the warped siding she had found during one of her perimeter walks, the corner of something large and square sitting on a faded red rug. She put on every layer she owned, 2 wool skirts, her heaviest coat, a scarf wound twice around her face and tucked in at the collar, her oldest hat pulled down past her ears. She opened the back door and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her like something physical, not gradual but immediate and total, the kind of cold that reminded you, in the clearest possible terms, that it had no opinion about whether you survived. She put her head down and moved. 20 feet to the main barn. She counted the steps without meaning to. Then past the woodpile, which she found with her hand more than her eyes. Past the second corral fence, felt rather than seen. The shape of the old barn came up out of the white ahead of her, darker than the snow around it, and she moved along the wall with one hand on the boards until she reached the door. The padlock was there. She stood in front of it with the wind trying to separate her from her hat, and she looked at it carefully. It was a good lock, heavy iron, old well made, but old in a particular way. The body of it had the quality of permanence rather than security. This was not the lock of a man keeping people out. This was the lock of a man keeping something safe from weather, from time, from the long indifference of the years. She looked at the door frame. The hinges were on her side. She found a flat stone along the base of the wall, half buried in the drifted snow, and she worked the hinge pins loose with it, patient, methodical, the way she did everything that mattered. The top pin first, working it up until she could grip it, then the bottom. She lifted the door sideways off its hinges and set it carefully against the wall of the barn, out of the direct path of the wind where it wouldn't blow over. Then she stepped inside. The wind stopped. The sound of it continued, battering the boards, pushing against the roof, but inside there was a stillness that felt almost physical after the chaos of the storm. She stood for a moment and let her ears adjust to the absence of it. The barn smelled of old cedar and dry air and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. It was dark in the way of a space that had been deliberately sealed against light. She had matches in her coat pocket. She had learned years ago to carry matches the way she carried her keys, as a matter of course, and she struck one and held it up. The space was not what she had expected. She had expected the accumulated disorder of a working ranch, broken equipment, old machinery, the layered debris of years. Instead, the interior was clean, not empty but tended. There were shapes stacked along the far wall under canvas covers, but swept clean, maintained with the regularity of a person who came in here on purpose and cared about what they found. The floor was clear, the air was dry and still in the way of a space that was cared for, and in the center of the room, on a rug that had once been red and was now the color of old rust, was the sea chest. The match went out. She struck another. The chest was large, perhaps 4 feet long, 2 feet high, made of close-grained cedar that had aged to a deep reddish brown. The lid had a lock that matched the padlock outside, old and deliberate, and across the top of the lid, burned into the wood in letters that were careful without being elegant, the work of a man who had taken his time because it mattered, was a single word: her name, Nell. She stood with the second match burning toward her fingers and looked at her own name on a chest in a locked barn on a ranch where she had lived for less than 2 months. And she felt the ground of her understanding shift in a way that was different from the chamomile and the room and the hinge pins she had just removed. This was harder. This was the thing underneath all the other things. The match burned her fingers. She dropped it and stood in the dark. There was a lantern hanging just inside the door, which was exactly where you would hang a lantern if you intended for someone to be able to find it. She located it by feel, found the matches beside it on the hook, and lit it. The flame caught, and she carried it to the chest and crouched down in front of it and put both hands flat on the cedar lid. Her name. She could see from the patina of the letters that this was not new work. The wood had oxidized evenly across the burned marks. No difference in tone between the letters and the surrounding grain. This had been done years ago, half a decade at least, possibly more. She stood and looked around the barn until she found what she needed near the canvas-covered stack against the wall, a short iron bar, the kind used for leverage on fence posts. She brought it back to the chest and worked the lock hasp with it carefully, applying pressure to the screws rather than the lock body, feeling for the give. She did not want to damage the chest. She wanted to open it. The distinction mattered to her. The hasp pulled free of the wood with a sound that was quieter than she expected. She lifted the lid. It swung up on leather hinges, heavily, and the smell of cedar intensified, and she leaned forward with the lantern. Letters. Dozens of them, stacked in careful order, each one in an envelope that had been sealed but never addressed. No names on the outside, no postmarks. These had never been sent. They had been written and folded and sealed and placed here in this chest in this order, and they had stayed here, in the dark and the cedar smell, waiting. She lifted the top envelope, turned it over. Nothing on the outside. She set the lantern on the floor, sat down cross-legged in front of the open chest with the wind working against the boards around her, and she opened the first envelope. The handwriting was Corbin's. She recognized it from the margins of the ledgers where he made notes in his spare, precise hand. But this was different from those annotations. This was slower, more deliberate. The handwriting of a man who was taking care with what he was setting down because it mattered more than anything he usually wrote. The date at the top of the page was October 1880. 9 years ago, she read. He didn't open with her name. He didn't open with a salutation at all. He simply began the way a person began speaking when they had been quiet for a long time and had finally found a place to put the words. He had seen her that afternoon on the mill road helping a woman whose wagon wheel had broken. He hadn't known the woman. Nell hadn't either, he noted. He'd been close enough to observe that much. She had simply seen what needed doing and done it. And when the woman tried to thank her, she had looked embarrassed by the attention in a way that suggested the gratitude was harder to receive than the work had been to give. He wrote that he didn't know why he was writing it down. He wrote that he only knew he didn't want to forget it. She set that letter down and held it for a moment with both hands. Then she reached for the next one. 6 months later, he had heard that her father died. He had seen her in town the week after and recognized the particular set of a person who had decided not to let other people see how badly they were hurting. He knew that expression, he wrote. He had worn it himself and knew what it cost to hold it. He had almost spoken to her. He wrote that he didn't know why he hadn't, only that he thought she might see straight through him and he hadn't been ready for that. She put that one down and picked up another. There were letters from the drought year when she had taken in sewing work from 3 different households in town. Work she was overqualified for, he noted. Work she did without complaint. There was a letter about an afternoon when she had sat with Walt Pearson's old dog on the steps of the livery when the animal was sick, just sitting with her hand on the dog's side for an hour without anyone asking her to. There was a letter about the winter she had given her good coat to a woman who arrived in Millhaven with 4 children and nothing adequate for the cold. You told Mrs. Alderman it was an old coat and you didn't need it anymore, he had written. It wasn't old. I had seen you wearing it 2 weeks before. She set that one down and pressed her lips together and breathed. The letters were not what she would have called romantic letters if someone had asked her before this moment to define the category. They were not full of declarations or the kind of language that reached for effect. They were something quieter, and she was beginning to understand that the quietness was the point. They were the record of a man paying attention. Sustained, specific, patient attention to a woman he had never approached, never made any claim on, never placed himself in the path of. He hadn't been accumulating her, he had been witnessing her. Writing down the things she did when she believed no one was watching, the small and unremarkable acts of decency that the world around her had consistently failed to notice or record. She kept reading. An hour into it, she found the letter from the spring he had fixed the guest room. The handwriting was the same careful hand, but the weight of what it carried had shifted into something more direct. He had been thinking, he wrote, about what he had told himself he would do if the right circumstances ever came. He thought the circumstances might be coming, though he couldn't say how or when. He could only feel it, the way you felt a change in the weather before the signs were visible. He was going to be ready, he wrote, because he would rather be prepared for something that didn't happen than unprepared for something that did. He had fixed the bedroom that day. The one that had been empty. He knew what she would want in it. Nell stopped. She set the letter down on her knee and put the back of her hand against her mouth and sat in the cedar-smelling dark with the lantern making its small circle of light and the storm working steadily against the boards around her. And she did something she had not done in years. Something she had been careful not to do. Not in the road with her satchel. Not in the livery in the cold. Not in the formal 11 minutes of a ceremony that changed everything about her life without giving her a moment to feel the weight of it, she cried. Not the controlled kind. Not the kind she allowed herself in private quietly, with her face composed and her breathing managed. The other kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere deeper than decision, that moves through you whether you have organized your permission for it or not. The kind that has been waiting for a long time and does not care that the timing is inconvenient. She sat on the floor of a locked barn in a Montana blizzard with a stranger's letters in her lap, and she cried in the way that a person cried when they finally understood that they had been seen. Not surveilled, not admired from a distance with any expectation of return, not watched with the proprietary interest of someone who had decided they owned a piece of her. Seen, the way you saw something you valued, the way you looked at something you didn't want to lose. 9 years. He had carried this for 9 years without saying a word, without placing himself in her path, without asking for anything, without arranging the circumstances to produce the outcome he wanted. He had simply watched and written and waited, and when she had finally arrived at his door with her $38 and her cracked satchel and her proposal, that was the most honest thing she had ever said to another person. He had said yes before she finished the sentence. Because he had already said yes 9 years ago probably. Sitting down at a desk with a pen in his hand to write about a woman helping a stranger on the mill road, he had already made this particular decision, and everything since then had been the long patience of a man who understood that the only version of it worth having was the version she chose freely. She sat in that barn for a long time. The storm continued outside, indifferent and thorough the way storms were, but the barn held, the lantern held. She sat with the letters in her lap and she didn't read any more of them. She had read enough, she understood what they were. Finally, she put them back. Each one in order, careful with the edges, the way you were careful with things that had been kept carefully. She closed the lid and tried to fit the hasp back into its holes as best she could without the screws. She left the iron bar leaning against the chest. She carried the lantern to the door and looked out at the storm. Getting back to the house was harder than getting to the barn. The wind had strengthened in the time she had been inside, and it pushed back against her with a seriousness that required her full attention. She bent into it with her head down and counted her steps and thought about nothing except the next one and the one after that, which was how she had always gotten through things. The back door appeared out of the white exactly when it needed to. She went in and leaned against it from the inside and stood on the mat dripping melted snow and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She wasn't entirely sure whether it was the cold or something else. She suspected it was both, in proportions she couldn't yet separate. She was at the stove, adding wood with hands that were still not entirely steady when she heard the front door open. The sequence of it, the stomping, the latch, the brief rush of cold air, the door closing firmly, was one she knew by now without having to look. The particular sound of Corbin coming in. She heard him hang his hat, heard his boots on the floor moving toward the kitchen, then quiet, which meant he had seen her coat dripping by the back door and was making a decision about what to say. He came to the kitchen doorway. She turned to look at him. He was snow-covered and cold-faced, and he looked at her with that steady brown gaze, and then quite deliberately he looked at the back door and then back at her. "The old barn," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. A long moment. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the walls of the house, testing the seams, finding them solid. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "That's all you're going to say? What do you want me to say?" She turned back to the stove, not because she had something to do there, but because she needed a moment to decide what was true. "I read them," she said. "Most of them." He didn't answer right away. She heard him move into the kitchen and stop. She could feel him standing behind her with the particular quality of a person who has been waiting a long time for something to happen, and now it has. And the waiting is finished, and he doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes, you should have. I know." His voice was quiet. Not apologetic in the performing way, but in the way of a man saying a plain thing he had already made his peace with. "I didn't know how to explain it without it sounding like something it wasn't." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his coat still on and the snow still on his shoulders, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the settled stillness she had come to know. Something underneath that, something that was less resolved, something that was still in the process of deciding what it was. "What is it then?" she said. "If it's not what it sounds like." He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be real. "It's just what I noticed," he said, "written down so I wouldn't lose it. That's all it ever was." She held his gaze. 9 years is a long time to notice something. "Yes," he said, "it is." The kitchen was warm. The storm was loud outside the walls. Between them was the particular silence of two people standing on opposite sides of something that has finally been named, and neither of them knowing yet what to do with the naming. Nell looked at him, at the snow melting from his shoulders, at the hands that mended fences and handled animals with the same unhurried care, at the face of a man who had watched her give away her good coat on a cold day and had thought it was worth writing down. She didn't say anything else that night, but she didn't look away either. The days after the storm were strange between them. Not bad strange, not the kind of strange that meant something had broken or gone wrong. The kind of strange that came when furniture had been rearranged in a room you knew well, everything still in the same house, just occupying different space. You reached for things where they used to be and found air. You moved differently through the same rooms. They didn't talk about the barn again, not directly, but things had shifted in ways both of them could feel, and neither of them named. Corbin had always maintained a physical distance that wasn't unfriendly but was deliberate. He passed her in the kitchen with 6 inches to spare when 4 would have done fine, handed things to her at arm's length when setting them on the table would have been simpler. He still did those things mostly, but occasionally he didn't, and in those moments when the distance collapsed by a few inches, neither of them moved to restore it. She caught herself noticing. She didn't particularly like that, she noticed. She didn't stop. Frank noticed too, in the sideways way Frank noticed most things, without comment while appearing to be focused on something else entirely. He came in one morning looking for the account ledger she had been updating and found them both at the kitchen table not talking, Nell with the receipts and Corbin with a cup of coffee and a length of harness he was conditioning. Frank looked at the two of them for exactly the span of time required to take in the full picture, then looked at the ledger on the shelf, said, "Got what I need," and went back out. That afternoon he found a reason to fix something near the back fence that had been, as far as Nell could tell, perfectly fine the day before. She let herself find it faintly amusing, which surprised her. She had been finding small things funny lately. Small, unexpected things, the kind that required a certain amount of interior ease to register as funny rather than merely noted. She wasn't sure what that said about her current condition, but she decided not to examine it too closely. Some things were better received than analyzed. What she was examining, with the same methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered, was the property documentation. She had been working through the ranch's legal records since the second week. Survey maps, land grants, tax receipts, water rights filings. The kind of work that required patience and a tolerance for language that had been written by lawyers and clerks and county officials who prioritized precision over readability. She had both qualities in sufficient supply. She had organized everything into a coherent sequence, cross-referenced the survey maps against the county records she'd requested from Dylan, and built a picture of what Iron Creek Ranch was, legally and practically. The water rights were significant. The creek running through the east section of the property was the most reliable water source in a 6-mile radius, and the rights filing done by Corbin's father 30 years ago was comprehensive in a way that suggested a man who had thought carefully about what he was building and what it might face. She noted it and filed it and moved on to the next item. She was thinking about it again on a gray morning in late February when she looked up from the desk and out the kitchen window and saw the rider coming down the lane. He came at the pace of a man who considered himself expected. The horse was a big gray, well-kept in the way that spoke of money spent on appearance rather than on work. The rider was heavy in the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the posture of a man accustomed to looking down at things and finding them smaller than he was. 2 other riders came behind him with the quality of men who were paid to be present rather than useful. He rode into the yard and stopped in front of the house without dismounting, which said everything about what kind of visit this was. Corbin was already on the porch by the time Nell got to the door. He had seen them from wherever he had been and had arrived ahead of her, which meant he had been watching the lane. He stood with his hands at his sides, and that particular quality of stillness she had come to understand was not calm so much as restraint. The discipline of a man who had decided in advance how this was going to go and was holding himself to it. "Greer," the rider said. "Calloway," Corbin said. Warren Calloway was the kind of man who had been handsome once and now had the face of someone who had spent too many years being agreed with. He had pale eyes that moved over everything the way a man's eyes moved over an inventory, assessing, categorizing, estimating value. Those eyes moved from Corbin to Nell and back. "Your wife," he said, in the tone of a man confirming a piece of information he'd been given by a source he found adequate. "Yes," Corbin said. "I've heard." Calloway shifted in the saddle with the ease of a man comfortable on horseback and comfortable with his own authority in equal measure. "I'll be brief. I have a legal interest in the northeast section of this property." 40 acres running from the stone marker on the ridge down to the creek bend. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. My attorney filed a survey claim with the county last week. The original boundary filing from 1871 contains a technical irregularity that puts the ownership of those acres in question. One of the riders behind him moved forward to carry the document down. Corbin took it without unfolding it. That told Nell something about what he was feeling. He wasn't ready to look at it yet. He was holding himself steady first. "I'd like those acres vacated by the end of the month," Calloway said pleasantly. "There's a fence line that needs establishing." "Is there?" Corbin said. It wasn't a question. "The county will back up the survey. My attorney is thorough." Calloway's pale eyes moved to Nell again, briefly, with the particular quality of a dismissal that was designed to be felt without being provable. "I'll expect a response by Friday." He turned the gray horse without waiting for an answer and rode back down the lane with his 2 men behind him. Corbin stood on the porch and watched them go until they passed through the gate. Then he came inside and sat down at the table and opened the document. Nell came and stood beside him and read it over his shoulder. It was a survey claim filed by an attorney in Helena named Clifford Baines on behalf of Warren Calloway. The survey it referenced had been commissioned 14 months ago. The argument was that a 40-acre section in the northeast corner of Iron Creek Ranch had never been properly incorporated into the Greer deed because of an irregularity in the original 1871 filing, specifically that the boundary marker referenced in that filing was a bend in the East Creek, and the creek had since shifted its course. She read it twice. Then she went to the study and came back with the original land grant, the survey map she had organized, and the water rights filings. She sat across from Corbin and spread everything on the table. "The northeast section," she said. "Tell me about the creek." He looked at the map. "Greer land since my father built the first fence line. He filed the claim himself. I've seen the filing." She put her finger on the relevant line in the 1871 document. "The grant uses the creek bend as a boundary marker." She moved her finger to the survey map. "And here is the creek as it runs now." She looked at him. "It's not in the same position." He studied the map. Big melt year, maybe 15 years back. Channel shifted about 30 feet east, which means the original boundary marker, as physically described in the filing, no longer exists in the location described. She tapped the Calloway document. "That's what this argument is built on. It's not frivolous. The creek moved and someone resurveyed from its current position and argued the boundary moved with it." She sat back. "But it's not airtight either, and I think they know it isn't airtight. I think they're counting on you not having the time or the documentation to push back properly." Corbin was looking at the table with the expression she recognized as thinking. Not at the papers, at the table. The way he went somewhere interior when something required his full attention. "What would you need?" he said. "Everything. Every piece of paper connected to that northeast section going back as far as you have it. Tax receipts that list the acreage by name, county correspondence, the water rights renewal filings especially. Those describe the property boundaries in specific language." "Back room," he said. "There's a box." He got up and went to the back room, and she heard him moving things. The sound of boxes shifted and stacked. She sat with Calloway's document in her hands and read it a third time, slowly, looking for every assumption it made and every place those assumptions could be tested. She found 4. The box from the back room was a decade of accumulated paper, receipts, correspondence, survey notes, tax records, the kind of documentary sediment that built up around a piece of land over time and which most people treated as background noise rather than as the foundation it actually was. Corbin set it on the table beside her and stood there for a moment looking at it. "I'll be outside if you need anything," he said. She nodded and pulled the box toward her. The first day she spent sorting, the second day reading, the third day she began to build. She worked at the kitchen table because the light was best there. She moved between documents with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that getting this right mattered more than getting it done quickly. Corbin moved around her without interference, didn't hover, didn't offer opinions she hadn't asked for, didn't check on her progress with the anxious energy of a man who needed to be kept current. He brought coffee without being asked. Once, late in the afternoon of the second day, he set a plate of food near her elbow and said simply, "Eat something," and went back outside. She ate something. Patch came in on the third day looking for Corbin and found Nell alone at the table surrounded by paper and stopped in the doorway with the expression of someone who had interrupted something he wasn't certain he understood. "He's at the South Corral," she said without looking up. "Right." Patch didn't move. She could feel him still standing there. "Is it bad, the Calloway thing?" She looked up then. His young face had the quality of genuine concern she had come to appreciate. He didn't perform emotions, he simply had them, visibly, without much distance between feeling and expression. "I'm working on it," she said. "He's been after this ranch for 2 years, Patch said. He came in slightly and leaned against the doorframe, pulling his hat off and turning it in his hands. "Calloway, everyone in the valley knows it. He bought up 3 smaller operations last year, the Hensley place and 2 of the rear parcels on the north side. He wants water. His operation east of the ridge runs dry half the summer. I know, she said. That's why the claim is on those specific 40 acres and not the center of the property. The creek bend is what he actually wants, year-round water access. She picked up the water rights filing and looked at it again. This is what this is really about. Patch nodded, watching her. Frank says if Corbin has to fight it in court, it'll take years and cost more than it's worth. It won't take years, she said, and it won't cost what they're expecting. He looked at her with the expression of someone revising a previous assessment. You found something. I'm finding things. Go tell Corbin supper will be late tonight. He went. What she found by the end of the fourth day was a picture considerably cleaner than Warren Calloway had apparently expected when he sent his attorney to file a private survey with the county. The water rights renewal filings from 1878 and 1884 both described the Iron Creek Ranch boundaries in specific detail, including the northeast section. Both had been reviewed and approved by the county office with recorded boundary descriptions that matched the original 1871 grant precisely. The county had, on 2 separate occasions, and on the official record, acknowledged those 40 acres as Greer land. The survey Calloway was using had been commissioned by his own attorney. It had not been filed with the county. It had been presented as a legal instrument without being verified against the existing county record, which was not how the process worked, and which the county clerk in Dillon would have an opinion about. But the second thing she found was more significant. She almost missed it. It was in the 1884 water rights renewal, a handwritten amendment in the margin of the 3rd page, brief enough to overlook if you were moving through the document quickly rather than reading every word. 3 sentences, initialed on one side by the county clerk and on the other by a signature she had to look at twice before she recognized it. Elias Greer, Corbin's father. She held the document closer to the lamp and read the 3 sentences again carefully. The amendment noted that the eastern boundary marker of Iron Creek Ranch, as described in the original 1871 filing, was to be understood as fixed at its 1871 position regardless of any subsequent changes to the course of the creek. It noted further that the creek bed shift of approximately 1873 or 1874 had been observed and recorded, and that this shift did not alter the legal boundary of the property as established and filed. She sat back in her chair and felt the particular satisfaction of finding the thing you had been looking for, which was its own specific feeling, different from happiness and quieter than triumph, but unmistakable when it arrived. Someone had anticipated this problem. 30 years ago, someone had stood in a county office in Dillon and dictated 3 sentences into the margin of a water rights renewal and initialed them alongside the county clerk. And those 3 sentences were still there, in the official record, waiting. She took the document to the lamp and read it one more time. Then she went to find Corbin. He was in the barn in the evening quiet, doing the small maintenance work that kept a working ranch from developing larger problems, the kind of steady, patient attention to accumulated detail that she had come to recognize as characteristic of how he approached everything. She stood in the barn doorway and waited for him to look up. He looked up. Your father filed an amendment in 1884, she said, in the water rights renewal. 3 sentences in the margin, countersigned by the county clerk. She held up the document. The boundary is fixed at the 1871 position regardless of the creek shift. It's in the official county record. Calloway's survey is measuring from a creek position that the county already ruled doesn't change the property line. Corbin set down what he was holding and came to where she stood and took the document from her. He read it slowly, then he read it again. He knew, Corbin said. Not surprised exactly, confirmed. The tone of a man hearing something that explained something else. My father knew someone would try this eventually. He was a thorough man. More than I gave him credit for. He handed the document back. His face had changed in the way of a thing releasing, a tension she had been watching in him since Calloway rode up the lane, finally loosening its grip. He looked at her steadily. What do we do with it? We take it to the county office in Dillon before Calloway's attorney can file anything further. We present the full record, the original grant, both water rights renewals, the amendment, and we ask the county clerk to issue a written confirmation of the existing boundary. She folded the document carefully. When Calloway's attorney shows up with his private survey, the county will already have a formal position on record. That makes his survey worth considerably less than he's paid for it. Corbin looked at her for a long moment. It wasn't the expression she would have expected, relief, or something like gratitude. It was the expression she had been noticing in him with increasing frequency since the night of the storm. The one that had the weight of everything between them in it, everything that had been named and everything that had not yet been, all of it present in the way he looked at her. We leave in the morning, she said, before he could say whatever he was deciding about. He nodded once, before first light. She went back to the house to put the documents in order for the trip. Arthur Peel ran the county clerk's office in Dillon with the focused, systematic precision of a man who had chosen his work deliberately and intended to do it well for as long as he was capable of it. He wore the same brown vest every time anyone had ever seen him and maintained his filing system with an organizational logic that was entirely his own and which he had never fully explained to any of his deputies. He was also, as it turned out, a man who took genuine professional offense at the idea of a private survey being used to contradict a 30-year county record. He read the amendment in the 1884 filing with the attention of a man recognizing something that had been done correctly. Elias Greer, he said, mostly to himself, filed this himself. He looked up at Corbin. I remember your father, solid man. Came in on a Tuesday. Yes, sir, Corbin said. Peel went through the full package of documents Nell had prepared, organized by date, cross-referenced, accompanied by a one-page summary that laid out the relevant points in plain language without legal ornamentation. He read the summary first, which she had expected, then went back and read 3 of the original documents in full. The Calloway claim hasn't been formally filed with this office, Peel said. It wasn't a question. As far as we know, it's been presented verbally and by documents shown on our property, Nell said. We don't believe it's been filed here. It hasn't. Peel said it with the flat certainty of a man who would know. What you're asking for is a written confirmation of the existing boundary position. Yes, with specific reference to the 1884 amendment. Peel looked at the amendment again, pressing both hands flat on his desk in the manner of a man coming to a conclusion. 2 days to pull the full file and cross-reference formally, but based on what you've brought me, he tapped the amendment with one finger. This is about as clear as I've seen. The position is fixed. Any survey that uses the current creek bed as its reference point is starting from the wrong location. We'll wait in Dillon, Nell said. Peel looked at her over the top of his glasses with the assessing gaze of a man who had seen a great many people come through his office carrying a great many problems and recognized competence when it stood in front of him. You put this together yourself? Yes. He made a sound that was the closest thing to approval that a county clerk in Dillon apparently permitted himself, and went back to his files. They ate supper that evening at a small establishment off the main street where the food was adequate, and the coffee was considerably better than that. It was the first time they had sat across from each other somewhere other than their own kitchen, and there was a quality to it that was different, slightly more visible to each of them, slightly less sheltered by the familiar routines of the house. They talked about the spring planting and what Frank had said about the south fence needing full replacement before summer. They talked about Bess Halloran, the 17-year-old from the western settlement who had come to Nell about taking on some of the sewing work that had been accumulating faster than one person could manage. They talked about the East Creek and whether the water level in March would be higher than last year. And then Corbin said, without particular setup, Patch's real name is Clarence. Nell looked at him. Clarence William Drury, Corbin said. He told me when I hired him and asked me never to use it. I have not used it once. Clarence, she said. It explains everything. She laughed. It came out before she had decided to let it, which was the only way it would have come out at all. She wasn't a woman who performed amusement, and genuine laughter had been scarce enough in the past several years that she had almost stopped expecting it. But it arrived, real and unguarded, and Corbin heard it and did not look away. And she looked at the table for a moment to collect herself, and when she looked back up, he had the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he intended to remember. The written confirmation from Arthur Peel arrived on the afternoon of the second day. 4 pages, formally typed, stamped and signed, and registered in the county ledger. It confirmed the Iron Creek Ranch boundary as established in the 1871 filing, reaffirmed in both subsequent water rights renewals, with specific reference to the 1884 amendment addressing the creek bed shift and the fixed nature of the boundary marker. She read it 3 times in Peel's office. This is sufficient, she said. More than, Peel said, with the dry satisfaction of a man who had done his job well and knew it. Calloway came back on a Thursday, 1 day past the deadline he had set himself, which told her something about the state of his confidence. He brought his attorney this time, Clifford Baines from Helena, thin and precise in a good coat, carrying a leather briefcase with the manner of a man who considered himself the most capable person in any room he entered. They rode into the yard and Corbin met them outside. Nell stood on the porch. Baines opened with the survey claim and the legal language and the measured implication that this could become expensive and prolonged if the current residents of Iron Creek Ranch chose to make it so. He was practiced at this. He delivered it with the smooth efficiency of someone who had used the same architecture of threat many times and found it generally effective. Corbin let him finish. Then he looked at Nell. She came off the porch with the county confirmation in her hand and gave it to Corbin, who handed it to Baines without comment. Baines opened it, his professional expression held through the first page. She watched his eyes move through the second page, and she identified the precise moment he found the 1884 amendment referenced in Peel's formal language. His jaw tightened briefly, in the way of a man encountering something he had not been told to expect. He read through to the end. The county has confirmed the boundary as established in 1871, Nell said. She kept her voice even and informational, the way she kept her account columns clean. No flourish, no heat, just the numbers as they actually were. Your survey uses the current creek position as its reference point. The county addressed the creek shift in 1884 and ruled explicitly that it does not alter the legal boundary. That ruling is in the official record, and the confirmation we received Tuesday references it directly. She paused one beat. Your claim has no legal standing. Baines looked at the document again as though it might have changed. It was the look of a careful man rechecking his arithmetic and finding the same answer he didn't want. Furthermore, she continued, if this proceeds to any formal legal challenge, the full sequence of filings will be presented to the court. That sequence will make it clear that this claim was filed after a private survey that failed to account for existing county record. That's not a position I would want to defend before a judge in Dillon County. Calloway had been quiet through all of this. She looked at him now. He was looking at the document in Baines' hand with the expression of a man recalculating. Not angry, recalculating. The expression of a man who had estimated the resistance he would meet and found he had estimated it incorrectly. Clifford, he said. Baines handed him the document. Calloway read it himself, quickly, the speed of a man used to legal language, and she watched him find the amendment and the county clerk's stamp and Peel's formal language of confirmation. His pale eyes came up and moved from the document to Nell and then to Corbin. The amendment, he said, mostly to himself. Filed by my father, Corbin said, 30 years ago. A silence settled over the yard. The particular quality of a position collapsing inward on itself. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet internal sound of a calculation that no longer added up. We'll need to review this further, Baines said, with the professional composure of a man retrieving what could be retrieved. You're welcome to, Nell said. You know where to find us. Calloway looked at Corbin for a long moment. The look of a man who had made a mistake in his assessment of what he was dealing with and knew it, and had no intention of acknowledging it out loud. Greer, he said. Calloway, Corbin said. Calloway turned his horse. Baines gathered his briefcase. They rode back down the lane without looking back. Frank came around the corner of the barn where he had been performing some maintenance that had apparently required his presence in that exact location during that exact exchange. Well, he said. Well, Corbin said. Nell was already walking back to the house because the kitchen table was still covered in documents and there was supper to think about, and her hands needed something to do. She was halfway up the porch steps when Corbin said her name. She stopped and turned. He was still standing in the yard where Calloway had left him, and he was looking at her with the expression that had been building since the night of the storm. The one that wasn't settled in the way his face was usually settled. The one that was still waiting for something. I owe you more than thank you, he said. She looked at him for a moment. The late winter light was doing something particular to the yard, pale and clear, the kind of light that made things look precisely like themselves rather than like approximations. The kind of light that didn't allow much softening. You don't owe me anything, she said. This is my home. She heard herself say it and felt it land differently than she had intended. Not wrong, true, but more than she had planned to put into the air right now, with him standing in the yard looking at her that way. She had said it as a statement of fact, practical and accurate, and it had come out sounding like something else too. Something she hadn't quite organized yet. She went inside before she said anything else. She stood in the kitchen with her hands on the table and the documents spread around her, and she let herself feel the weight of what she had just said and what it meant, and how thoroughly, without quite deciding to, she had come to mean it. The word stayed with her for days. Home. She turned it over the way you turned something over when you found it and weren't sure yet whether it was worth keeping. Not ready to put it down, not yet certain what you had. She had had homes before, the house where she grew up, which was gone. The room at Mabel Hutchins, which had been shelter more than home, though she hadn't admitted that to herself until it was taken from her. A person could mistake 4 walls and a roof for belonging if they stayed in one place long enough. She had made that mistake before. She did not want to make it again about something that turned out to be a different thing than it appeared. But she was not being dishonest with herself. That was the practice she had maintained through everything. The dead harvest, the dead marriage, the dead winter that took what was left. She would not start being dishonest now, when it mattered most. The workshop was what finally made her understand the difference between shelter and home. She had mentioned it to Corbin on a Tuesday evening, practically, in the way she mentioned everything practical. Not as a request, but as a fact she was reporting that he might have relevant information about. She was running out of space at the kitchen table. The sewing work had expanded beyond what one surface could accommodate, and she had turned down 2 orders that month because she simply did not have the room. The storage room off the south side of the main barn, Corbin said before she had finished explaining the problem. I've been keeping feed there, but I can move that. She had been bracing for a conversation about whether the demand would last and whether the cost of setting it up made practical sense. The immediate practical answer was not what she had prepared for. That room gets the morning light, he said, south-facing window. She looked at him. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ornamentation, as though noting the window's orientation was simply a relevant fact and not evidence that he had already been thinking about this before she brought it up. She was beginning to understand that about him. He thought about things long before he said them. He just didn't announce the thinking. I'll need a proper work table, she said, and shelving. Patch can build shelving. He's better with wood than with harness work. That is a low bar. It genuinely is. She almost smiled. She turned back to her ledger so he wouldn't see it, but she suspected from the quality of the brief silence that followed that he had noticed anyway. Patch built the shelving over 4 days in early April with a focused earnestness that was genuinely touching and a result that was genuinely characteristic, solid in the structural sense, but not quite level in the way that suggested the floor was to blame. She tested each shelf and found them all capable of bearing weight. The middle one ran slightly downhill from left to right. "I can fix it," Patch said, examining it from several angles. "Leave it," she said. She put her hand on the lower end. "I'll put the heavier spools here. It'll balance out." He accepted this with the visible relief of a young man who had been given a dignified way to be wrong and went back to whatever Frank had waiting for him. The work table appeared one morning without announcement. She had noticed the sawdust outside the barn the previous 2 evenings and had understood what it meant, and then on a Wednesday morning the table was there, finished, sanded, set exactly where it needed to be, at the height that was right for someone of her build doing close work. No ceremony about it, no mention of it, just the table, which was now present and had not been before. She stood in the new workshop in the morning light, with Patch's uneven shelves along the wall and Corbin's table in the center, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Not contentment exactly. Something more alert than contentment, something closer to the feeling of standing on solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing and noticing for the first time the difference in what solid felt like under your feet. The first client she received in the workshop was a woman named Dora Halloran from the Western Settlement who needed 3 dresses let out and 2 work shirts resized. Dora looked around the workshop when she arrived and said, "This is a proper operation," and Nell felt something she recognized belatedly as pride. Not the performed kind, but the real kind, the kind that didn't need anyone else to confirm it. She charged fair prices. She had spent years undervaluing her work out of the habit of desperation, and she was finished with that. The work was good and getting better, and the prices were fair, and the clients kept coming and sending others. By late spring, she had a waiting list 3 weeks long. She mentioned it to Corbin over supper one evening in May, not as a boast because she did not operate that way, but because it was part of what Iron Creek Ranch was now, and she kept him current on the ranch's full picture the way she kept the ledgers current. 3 weeks out, she said. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was actually processing rather than simply waiting for his turn to respond. "Is the space going to be enough? For now. Another season, maybe not." He nodded slowly. "We could build out the back wall of that room. Add 12 feet or so. That's significant construction. Spring is a good time for it." He set his fork down and looked at her across the table with that expression, the one that wasn't quite settled, the one that was still carrying something. "If you're staying." The last 2 words landed differently than the rest of the sentence. She heard them for what they were, not a comment about construction timing, but the question he had been carrying for months and had finally set down on the table between them where both of them could look at it. Because she had come here desperate. Because the arrangement they had made at his front door on a frozen morning was a transaction, not a promise. Because nothing that had happened since, not the letters, not the barn, not the documents spread across a county clerk's desk in Dillon, had formally changed the terms of the original agreement, and he knew that, and he had apparently decided that this, in the even light of an ordinary supper in May, was the way he was going to ask. She set her own fork down. "Corbin," he looked at her. "I told you this was my home," she said, "when Calloway rode away. I said it. You heard me say it." She held his gaze. "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know that," he said, "but you said it in a particular moment. I didn't want to assume it meant more than the moment itself." She considered him, this man who had watched her from a careful distance for 9 years and had never once placed himself in her path, who had carried a cedar chest full of letters about her life and her small acts and her surviving and had never used any of it as leverage or claim, who had said yes at a door before she finished her sentence and then spent months not asking her what the yes had meant for her, who built work tables in the dark without mentioning it, and left lamps burning low and understood without being told that she needed to do things herself before she could accept them being done for her. He had been patient with her in a way that no one had ever been patient with her, and she understood now that it was because he had had years to practice. She understood something else, too, sitting at that kitchen table in the May evening with the windows showing the first real light of a real spring. She had been waiting for certainty before she let herself feel what she had been feeling for months, waiting until she was sure enough to risk it. And the problem with that kind of waiting was that certainty about another person was not a thing you arrived at by standing still. It was something you earned by moving toward them. "I'm staying," she said, "not because I have nowhere else to go. I have somewhere to go. I have $38 and a horse and a skill set that pays a waiting list 3 weeks long, and I could build something elsewhere if I needed to." She kept her voice steady because this mattered enough to say clearly and not have it blurred by feelings she hadn't yet organized. "I'm staying because I want to be here. Because I read those letters, Corbin. All of them. And I know what you saw when you looked at me all those years, and I think you saw something true." She pressed her hands flat on the table, "And I would like to be seen like that for the rest of my life." The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at her with that particular stillness, the one she had first seen in his doorway on the frozen morning she arrived, the one she had spent months learning to read. Present, fully present in the way that some people never manage to be. "There was a letter I never finished," he said. She frowned slightly. "I went through all of them. It wasn't in the chest." He was quiet for a moment. "I started it last fall. Before you came. I had a feeling, the kind I'd learned to trust by then, that something was changing, that whatever was going to happen was close." He looked at his hands and then back at her. "I got about 3 sentences in and I stopped. Because everything I'd written before, I wrote because I thought I'd never say any of it to you directly. And this one, I thought maybe, if the day ever came, I'd rather say it than write it." She looked at him across the table. "The day came," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did. Then say it." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she could see him doing what he always did, not hesitating, but making certain of himself before he spoke, making sure the words were the right ones. He was a man who took the weight of words seriously, who did not say things and then retract them. She had understood that about him for a long time. "I love you," he said. "I have for a long time. Not in a way that wanted something from you. I need you to understand that. The letters were never about getting anything. They were just the only way I knew to hold on to what I saw, what you were. What you are." He held her gaze with the same steady certainty he brought to everything that mattered. "And I would like to spend whatever time I have left being the person who knows you best, if you'll let me." She sat with that for a moment. Not because she was uncertain. She was finished being uncertain. She had been uncertain long enough, and it had served its purpose, and now it was done. She sat with it because she wanted to actually feel it rather than immediately managing her way through it to the next thing, which was her habitual response to moments that mattered. She had spent her life processing important things rather than inhabiting them. She was trying to do it differently. She let it land. "I'm not easy to know," she said finally. "I should tell you that honestly before you commit to it. I work too much. I think too much. When I'm worried about something, I don't say so. I go quiet and I organize things, and I can be difficult to reach during those times, and I know it." "I know," he said, simply, without qualification. "You don't, Nell." His voice was gentle but certain. "I know." Of course he knew. He had been watching her manage her way through difficulty for 9 years. He knew exactly what she did when she was frightened, and what she did when she was angry, and what she did when she was trying to appear fine when she wasn't. He had written it all down so he wouldn't forget it. "All right," she said. "All right," she breathed. "I love you too. I don't know exactly when it started, somewhere between the chamomile and the table you built without saying anything about it. But it's there, it's been there for a while. And it's not going anywhere." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand and held it. They sat like that in the May evening light without saying anything else for a while, because some things had already been given all the words they needed. The cedar chest came out of the barn the following week. Corbin carried it himself, which required some doing. It was heavier than it looked, and the doorways required maneuvering. She offered to help, and he declined with the quiet firmness of a man who understood that certain things needed to be done by the person who had carried them. She let it go because she understood that too. He brought it through the back door and through the kitchen and into the front room and set it against the wall beneath the window and stepped back and looked at it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it too. It was different in the daylight. In the barn, by lantern light, it had been mystery and weight and revelation. Here in the front room, it was simply a chest. Old cedar, well made, with her name burned into the lid in letters that were careful without being elegant. It looked like what it was, a thing a man had built and filled and kept because he hadn't known what else to do with what he felt. "It doesn't need to be here," Corbin said. "If you'd rather, no." She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at the chest and thought about everything inside it. "It stays, you're certain?" "It's not a secret anymore," she said. "It shouldn't live in a locked barn." She crouched down and ran her fingers across the letters of her name, the way she had in the barn that first time. In the dark, in the storm. Only now there was light coming through the window and the letters were warm from the morning sun. "It's part of what this is, where we are. I don't want to put it away." He crouched down beside her and they both looked at the chest. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," he said. "Any of it. You were afraid I'd feel like I owed you something, or that the choice wasn't really mine." "Yes," he looked at her. "I wanted you to stay because you wanted to, not because you felt like you'd been given something you needed to pay back." She held his gaze. "That's why you never put yourself in my way. All those years. You could have spoken to me any number of times. Yes, if you'd made yourself known, and I'd eventually come here, you'd never have been certain it was a real choice." He was quiet for a moment. Something like that. She thought about this, about a man who had wanted something for 9 years and deliberately held himself out of the way of getting it because he needed it to be freely given or not at all. That kind of wanting was rare, the kind that didn't consume or maneuver or arrange things to its own advantage, the kind that simply held itself still and kept the lamp burning and trusted that if the day came it would be because the other person had chosen it. She stood up. He stood up beside her. "It was a real choice," she said. I came to your door because I was desperate and I had nowhere else to go. That part is true. But everything after that was mine. I want you to know that. I know, he said. And he believed it. She could see that he believed it, and she was glad because it was true. Summer came into the valley the way Montana summer always did. Slowly, with several second thoughts, but eventually with genuine commitment. The grass came back. The creek ran high with the melt. Iron Creek Ranch woke from its long white sleep and became something alive again in the full sense of the word. The workshop expanded in June. Corbin and Frank and a carpenter from Dillon worked on the back wall for 10 days, and when they were finished, there was nearly double the previous space. Nell stood in the middle of it on the first morning after completion and turned in a slow circle and thought, yes, this is exactly enough. Bess Halloran came on as her assistant in July, 17 years old with steady hands and a good eye and the quality of a person who learned faster when they were treated as capable rather than as a student. Nell paid her fairly, not cheaply, not as a favor, and expected her to arrive on time and do the work correctly and didn't tolerate shortcuts. And Bess responded to this as though it were a gift, which perhaps it was. She had been underestimated long enough to understand the value of someone who didn't. The town came around the way small towns came around when they had no other choice. Not warmly, not with apology, but with the pragmatic recalibration of people who had assessed a situation incorrectly and were quietly adjusting their position without acknowledging the adjustment. Helen Voss did not apologize. Nell had never expected her to, and would not have known what to do with it if she had. But the particular variety of whispered commentary that had followed Nell through her first weeks in Millhaven grew quieter, and then stopped, replaced by the grudging acknowledgement of people who had encountered her work and her ledger-keeping and her county documentation and decided that engaging with her honestly was a more sensible investment than engaging with her otherwise. That was enough. It was more than she'd had before. Dorothy Crane came by every few weeks with things from her kitchen and the direct, unsentimental company of a woman who said what she meant and expected the same in return. On one of those afternoons in late summer, Dorothy looked at the cedar chest under the front room window and said, "What is that?" Nell told her. Not everything. Some of it belonged to Corbin alone, and some of it was too interior to share even with someone she trusted. But the shape of it. A man who had watched her from a distance for years. Letters that had never been sent. A chest with her name burned into it before she'd had any reason to be on this land. Dorothy was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then she said, 9 years and he never said a word? Not until I found it. Dorothy looked at her coffee. I misjudged him. Most people did, Nell said. He doesn't make it easy to understand him quickly. Do you understand him? Nell considered that honestly. Better than I did, not completely. She picked up her cup. I don't think that part is ever really finished. Dorothy nodded slowly. No, she said. I don't suppose it is. The evening she remembered afterward, the one that stayed with her the way certain evenings stayed. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything that needed to be true was true all at the same time, was an ordinary one in the first week of September. Supper was finished. The dishes were done. The light outside was doing the thing it did in early autumn in the valley, going from gold to amber to the deep clear blue of an evening without clouds, and she was sitting on the porch steps with a length of leather in her lap that she was stitching for a client's saddlebag. Corbin was in the yard doing something with a fence post that had been listing for a week. From inside the barn, she could hear Patch talking to one of the horses in the one-sided, confiding way he had with animals, which she had stopped finding odd and now found simply characteristic. Somewhere further out, she could hear Frank, the distant rhythmic sound of something being set right. The evening smelled of turned earth and wood smoke, and the clean, particular smell that came after a clear day in high country. The kind of smell that didn't try to be beautiful, it just was. Corbin straightened up from the fence post and looked at it. Then he came and sat down on the step beside her, close enough that his shoulder was near hers in the easy way of two people who had stopped managing the distance between them. She kept stitching. He looked at the yard and the fence and the evening coming down, and neither of them said anything, and it was the right kind of not saying anything, the kind that had room in it, the kind that was comfortable in its own skin, the kind that didn't need to be filled. She thought about the woman who had ridden to this porch on a frozen morning with a cracked satchel and $38, and a proposal she had made because survival had stripped away every other option. She thought about what that woman had expected from the arrangement. A transaction, a roof, a way through the winter and nothing more. Something temporary, something practical, something she would endure and be grateful for, and eventually move on from. She had not expected this. She thought it was probably worth saying. Not to start a conversation. Just to say a true thing into the evening air where it could be heard. I didn't think it would be like this, she said. Corbin looked at her. Like what? She thought about how to say it honestly, like something I built. She kept her eyes on the leather for a moment. Everything before this, I survived it. That was the word for it. I survived the harvest failing, and I survived the marriage, and I survived the winters, and I survived losing the room at Mabel's, and I survived riding out here in the dark. She paused. This doesn't feel like surviving. He was quiet in the way that meant he was listening all the way through. What does it feel like? She looked up from her work. She looked at the yard, at the fence post that was holding now, at the barn with its light on inside, at the evening settling over the valley with its long, unhurried patience. She thought about Frank and Patch and Dorothy Crane and Bess with her steady hands. She thought about the workshop with its uneven shelves and its south-facing window, and the table that had appeared one morning without announcement. She thought about the cedar chest under the front room window with her name in the wood and the letters inside it that had been written for no audience but the man who needed to write them. She thought about all of it, and she said the only true thing. Like something I chose. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She went back to her stitching, and he stayed where he was, and the evening came down around them both. Unhurried and without sentiment, the way the valley held everything. Without preference, without promise, without guarantee. Just the land and the light going, and two people sitting in the particular piece of a life that had been hard-earned, and was therefore real. That was what she had learned. Not a lesson that could have been told to her in advance. The kind that only made sense after you had lived the length of it. That the things worth having were almost never the things you arrived at easily. That a person who had been unseen for long enough could stop recognizing what it felt like to be seen, even when someone had been seeing them for years. That desperation and love were not opposites. Sometimes desperation was simply the last door you had to go through to get somewhere worth being. And that home was not a thing you were given. It was a thing you chose and kept choosing every ordinary evening until the choosing became so much a part of you that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like who you were. She finished the seam and held it up to the last of the light to check the tension. It was good work. She folded it and set it on the step beside her. Corbin was still there. She leaned slightly, just slightly, the smallest possible shift of weight, and her shoulder found his. He didn't move away, neither did she. The last light left the valley, and the stars came out over Iron Creek Ranch, and they sat together in the dark that was not frightening at all.